With us in the studio is Zach Schonbrun, a regular contributor to the New York Times, and as well to SB Nation last week when he wrote a long feature called Take Me Out to the Brain Game, and it wondered whether or not the next frontier is neuroscience for analytics. Last week we talked in the stat school about sort of how analytics had evolved from one stat to the next stat to the next stat, but maybe we have to stop thinking about what's on the field and maybe what's sort of innate in players. As one of the main characters in the piece, Jason Sherwin, said to Zach, you know the Disney movie $1 Million Arm, about referring to the two pitching prospects who were discovered in India? We're helping baseball teams find the $1 million brain. So, Zach, welcome to Hot Takedown.
Thank you very much. Pleasure.
So, how did the story come about? How did you find these two guys? And you know, are they plucky upstarts who are trying to make this happen, or is there some adoption in baseball for trying to look at what's happening in players' brains and figure out if they're going to be any good?
Yeah. So, I wish I had an interesting story to tell you about how I found these guys, but really it was happenstance. I happened to be glancing through a Columbia publication, one of their alumni magazines, and they had done a little story about these two guys. This was last November. They were just really starting out in this field of what their company was getting involved in, and I found them really intriguing. I thought what they were doing was different from what I'd kind of seen around a little bit about neuroscience and baseball and neuroscience and sports. So I reached out to them and started kind of talking about what they're doing, and I wanted to take a deeper dive into what exactly is going on with neuroscience, what they're doing, what they're trying to do,
and give a rundown of exactly what they are doing. So they're having players take a test.
So what they're doing is they're the first and only, as far as I know and as far as they know, to actually use an EEG or an electrode cap, which I describe as a luminescent swim cap, basically, that they have the players wear as they're playing a very basic video simulation. And it's just a pitch coming in, and they tap a key on the keyboard to swing or to not swing. And what that electrode cap is able to do is sort of register or monitor or measure when exactly the decision is being made. That is the decision to swing or the decision not to swing, because it's a conscious decision to let the pitch go by if it's not what they want. That's sort of basically what they're doing. They're also able to measure some other things like concentration levels and a few different other metrics, but the main gist is this decision of whether to swing or not to swing. And with that data, this is very novel, unique data that no one's really been able to quantify before, and they're able to get a very precise measurement down to the millisecond of when that decision is made. So that's what they're now talking to teams about possibly using.
Now, when you talk about measuring players, I guess the next step would be at least to have some sort of measuring tool to see what actual Major League Baseball players, like what their timing looks like compared to the case studies that they did. Are they anywhere near being able to get some of that data from actual professionals whose reaction times must be, you would think.
Yeah.
And maybe it would show us that they're not as great.
Right.
Some of them is not as great as we think. But is that the next step for them?
Yes. They're close. They visited 4 spring training complexes this spring. They were mostly working, as far as I know, with minor league players. But they're also starting, as they build a bigger relationship with teams, they're going to start to evaluate major league players. Right now, what they've found, as they've done mostly college players and also minor league, is that there's a great degree of variance among even teammates on the same team in terms of the numbers of this decision, of the numbers of how they make this decision. So it's almost as big a spectrum as batting averages. And so, you have a guy hitting 300, but his pitch recognition might be somewhere around 350 milliseconds. And then from there, you can find other guys on the team that are batting 250 and have a 250 millisecond pitch recognition metric. So they've found a big degree of variance, and so from there you might be able to extrapolate that maybe there's a big difference.
So then if it's not that correlated, does that suggest that maybe it actually doesn't tell us that much?
Well, I think it's a good question. There's still a lot of questions about what exactly these numbers are telling us. You're right. And that's going to take time for teams to figure out and to use. And so one thing there's sort of two ways that teams might go about using this sort of data and information, and one is scouting, as I talk about in the story. You might be able to find players who have certain, you might be able to target certain players that have these numbers that you're looking for in terms of what it means to recognize a pitch quickly versus a player who's not recognizing pitches very quickly. So it might open up a whole new channels in scouting, or the other side is player development, and that if you have a player who seems to be struggling on the field, but you can't quite pinpoint why that is, you can then use this as another metric to say, okay, well, he's not recognizing pitches as well as some of his teammates, or he may not be recognizing a certain pitch as well as his teammates, and so from there, you can then coach or train, and that's kind of up to the coaches or the trainers to figure out what to do from there.
Yeah, and that's an interesting question of they have different pitch shapes. So are there people that maybe are better at recognizing, a fastball shape versus a curveball shape coming at them, and so maybe that could give you an idea of what you need to spend more time at the batting cage working on? Yeah,
I mean, absolutely. The simulation at this point is really only fastball, slider, and curveball. And it's not coming at different shapes. It's more the kind of the direction it's moving. The pitch is moving. And so, yeah, absolutely. I mean, they are able to pinpoint, like I said, the decision, the precise moment of the decision based on each individual pitch. So, yeah, there are certainly going to be some players who find that they're extremely capable of recognizing fastballs at a very high rate, but the curveball or the slider, it's just not quite up to par. So from there, you might be able to work with them.
I mean, it's slightly different than what they're doing in the NBA now, or some teams are doing with like the bioanalysis, right? Because it's solely focusing on the brain, but it is sort of like, it's almost like a prequel to what all of the data we then see on the court or on the field. But I'm wondering, like, and this is more of a broad question, and maybe Chad too, you can jump in, is there any way to do this sort of brain analysis in any other sport, or is it simply because baseball has this one moment that you can actually analyze the decision-making process versus, like, would this even have any application in basketball or
absolutely.
In football and in other sports?
They're absolutely. I mean, they're trying to get into those different areas. In fact, they actually started. When they were first, coming up with the idea to maybe get involved with sports. These are two neuroscientists that were working at Columbia. They were studying decision making, and they were also studying, what exactly makes up the difference between an expert and a novice. So when they started to kind of come together and think, okay, maybe we could apply this to sports, they were thinking that it might work with golf. They sort of changed their mind on that because...
How would it work with golf?
Well, they sort of decided that it wouldn't really work as well with golf as it would with baseball. But it got their minds thinking that there are plenty of other sports that this could absolutely apply to. I mean, if you think like a quarterback who has to read the field, who has to make decisions very quickly, basketball player, running a transition, he's got to find the open guy, he's got to see the court. They're even talking about working with police officers who have to make split-second decisions
about whether to pull a gun or whatnot.
Exactly.
I mean, is it kind of like the Wonderlic test, except in actual data form? Because it's kind of, Wonderlic is kind of trying to measure a whole bunch of different things about a quarterback's ability.
Yeah, and that has its own long history about maybe being a sham or not.
Totally.
You can read about it on FiveThirtyEight.com.
Absolutely, but it seems like a new way to measure whatever these supposed intangibles you want in a quarterback.
And there was even a story this week about Jameis Winston and how Tampa had gone and built some kind of simulator or licensed some kind of simulator to try to do this. It sounds like some version of this for football.
Well, and this is what's really interesting to me about this whole sub-genre of analytics, I guess, which is that we're used to analytics being about the product, about what happens on the field, about, we can say that someone bats 300, but his BABIP or his work plus, as we learned about last week, is, whatever it is, 135. But this is something that feels more about innate talent or innate self. And, you write in the piece that maybe this can be tweaked through various exercises or not, but it's interesting because we evaluate players based on, or athletes based on their innate physicality. but I don't think we're used to evaluating them on their innate intelligence or their innate brain makeup. And if it moves into that direction, it does feel like a different approach towards scouting players to you. Is that a fair characterization?
Absolutely. You mentioned the quote, the $1 million brain. What that sort of is getting at is that Mike Trout, let's just say, has $1 million brain in terms of this, exercise. So if they were able to test him and analyze him using the EEG and the electrode cap, I'd surmise that he probably would score pretty well. I mean, I'm sure he's recognizing pitches right out of the pitcher's hand very quickly, and I'm sure he's pretty accurate about that. 80 to 90%. So if they were able to score that, let's say at a level 10 out of 10, Mike Trout being the best. Their kind of idea is that there might be millions of people around the world who have that very same kind of innate pitch recognition ability, a 10 out of 10. And maybe they've never picked up a baseball bat before. But, picking up a bat and learning to swing, these are physical attributes that you can, I guess, theoretically develop. Just like those two pitchers from India never learned how to pitch before, but they both could throw 90 miles an hour, so a scout found them and is now teaching them how to pitch with some,
It's interesting. It sort of suggests that at some point, people who have some athletic talent will take some suite of tests in middle school or something, and they'll be told which sport to go to because
that already kind of happens at, there are tests now where you measure your lateral speed and all kinds of different, and they're like, you should play soccer because there's a longer, or tennis, or that already, but obviously that this is to a much higher degree of specificity.
So, Zach, in the piece, you took this test. Do you have $1 million brain?
No, more like a $5 brain.
So what was it like to take the test?
It was fun. It was very challenging, I would say. It's a very basic simulation. It's a white screen. You're on a laptop, and all it is a green dot that comes exploding toward your face, and you have to press a key when you decide to swing or not to swing. The reason you decide to swing is you're told what pitch to expect as a countdown, sort of like a 3, 2, 1. Your fastball's coming, and if it's a fastball, then you swing. If it ends up moving like a curveball or moving like a slider, you don't swing. So that's the. So
you're trying to identify the pitch that you're told is
exactly right. And you try and do this as quickly as possible, and obviously you want to be accurate. So I did this, they usually do about 3 trials of a total of about 90 pitches. My first trial, I was about 50% accurate. I was basically guessing. And that reason for that is it was very hard. It came very quickly, and you're just looking at a white screen, so you don't see the pitcher's wind up. You can't follow the ball out of his glove. You can't see the follow through, and all those things are extraordinarily important for a hitter to be able to hit. For the exercise, for the purpose of the exercise, just trying to measure that decision making time. It's useful enough. So,
do they plan to tweak the test to make it more like a simulating baseball, or do they like the rudimentary nature of it?
So I think they're sort of working with players about that. I think players have told them that they'd prefer to make it more of a simulation, sort of like they showed me one prototype they're working on. It's of Nationals Park in D.C. You see the flags waving, and you have a pitcher standing there. So they're definitely going to toy around with that, but for the purposes of the exercise, they don't need anything more. It's just a matter of comfort for the player, to feel comfortable playing the game.
Yeah, 'cause, I imagine some players are great at reading, the ball in the pitcher's hands, or certain cues that they've seen from a pitcher over 20 years of hitting that they're not getting in that simulation, which could affect their score.
Yeah, I think it could, but these guys are doing enough trials that they feel like the hitter, or the batter, is going to get used to it over a certain amount of time. And like I said, it's very simple, it's very basic. And it's almost purely just reaction time. But what they're not measuring the reaction time; they're measuring what's going on in the brain as they react.
Got it.
So how long until we know whether this is legit? At some point, I was at the Sloan conference, the Sloan Sports Analyst Conference last.
The Daryl Morey conference.
Our listeners know what Sloan is.
That's
on
right.
a first name basis. Last February or whatever it was, and the entire exhibitors hall was just filled with these companies who are promising to measure athletes in some way. And at some point, this stuff becomes snake oil, and it's hard at first to know what's snake oil and what's legit. So how do we know whether this actually does have an impact or an effect on the quality of it?
I mean, I tried to balance that in my story. I was constantly kind of thinking, what am I writing about here? Is it actually legitimate? And so, I think it's going to take time. I mean, I wrote about these guys because what they're doing is unique compared to the other neuroscience companies that are sort of making games like Lumosity type brain training stuff. So I like the fact that these guys were unique. But yeah, I mean, it's going to take time because they're working with teams kind of one go around. They've done one go around now, and now they're going to have to see results, and the teams that they're working with are going to have to see results, and they're going to have to come back to those teams and work with them again to see more results. So the last line in the piece involves Jason Sherwin saying something about saying to a scout, "I'll see you in 10 years." I don't think it'll be 10 years before we start seeing this more and more in Major League clubhouses, but it could be a few years.
And maybe that even would tell you if it turns out not to be as correlated as they believe, that it tells you how much pitch recognition makes a hitter, how they are, either a lot or maybe not as much. So the important thing is we'll know one way or the other, it seems.
Yeah, these guys aren't the only ones to study pitch recognition as a tool for measuring players. In fact, that's gone back many decades. There's things called occlusion tests that have been going on that are basically they have a video of a pitcher releasing the ball, and then they black out the screen as soon as the ball is released, and hitters are supposed to identify what pitch, where it's coming, and how fast it might be traveling, all these sorts of things. And so those sorts of tests have been going on for a long time, and they've determined that the best hitters tend to be the best at those pitch recognition drills. So this is This is different. This is measuring exactly. This is putting a quantifiable number next to how quickly those guys are recognizing pitches.
All right, so listeners, you can read Zach's piece on SB Nation, Take Me Out to the Brain Game. We'll also put a link to it on Hot Takedown's show page on 538. Zach, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure.